grateful we are for your time, for your expertise, and to ask you about what passion, what purpose really brings you to the conversation on cultural appropriation today. Could I start with you, Melissa?
Yeah, thank you, Asia. I think that when talking about creating stories, and imagining sort of, indigenous stories, that it's always important to recognize kind of that cultural appropriation sort of, moves within that space, and that we have to understand that that in order to make sure that people are able to tell their own stories, that we aren't cultural appropriating, that we aren't doing this in a way that is confusing the narrative. Because if we're talking about instances, experiences, objects that are not from our own experience, then we are subverting the narrative. So the way shared universe approaches this idea is that, well, then we must write it in collaboration. So yeah, I would say from the perspective of trying to do the right thing, that's sort of the way shared universe operates.
Thank you, Melissa. And just moving around, Nathan Shafer, tell us what brings you to this conversation. Obviously, you have a really deep investment in this work, and it's a unique one. I'm really grateful for that work that you're doing in Alaska today and how you're doing it. Could you tell us a bit more about your passion and purpose in this?
Well, that's thank you. I have no idea how to answer that right now, so I'm gonna just kind of talk a little bit about my thoughts on it. So I'm a new media artist, and I've been doing a lot of new media art in Alaska for like 10 years, 15 years since I've been back. And I've been very interested in history and humanities. And, a lot of my friends are just Alaskan people. And when we started making stories, it was one of those moments where we just, because of all the different conversations we've had about things, it was a good opportunity to put those into practice for me instead of just talking about those things. So a lot of it did come from like conversations with Holly initially, many years ago. It feels like a million years ago now, but just I don't feel like I've answered that question all the way. When the opportunity presented itself to do collaborative storytelling and to actually do work that that went right at, I know we were talking about the word culture being weird, but going right at languages and people and ways of being and ways of thinking and ways of existing with each other, and the intersections between all those things can be really scary for a lot of people that want to work in social practice and interactive work. So we, and as white people, we avoid them because we don't want to upset other people. But I don't know, it did it, and I found this wasn't something I like planned on doing or did a lot of before. But once I started working with Richard and Demi and Melissa regularly on stuff, I realized how just vastly rewarding and exciting for me. It's a stupid word, but like almost therapeutic. It brings a lot of happiness to me to feel those connections with other people, because that's all it really is. It's we're doing things together to make things better. I don't know. It sounds so silly to say it like that, but it's really, when we all get together, those are the decisions we try to make with each other, and it just feels good.
Thank you, Nathan. I definitely want to go back to that interesting point about the feeling that there's some healing work in this collaborative work. But let's keep turning in this circle toward all of the participants here today. Holly Nordlum, welcome. It's really wonderful to have you.
Thanks. I mean, that's perfect timing. Thank you for the healing conversation. As someone who works with trying to heal Native people and get over their traumas, you know, working one-on-one with the traditional tattooing that I do, I try to also do that with projects I'm working on. So I don't remember our initial conversations, Nathan, but I'm sure they were advocating for Native voices and how to work with Native people. And I think that even that conversation can be healing for Native people. That somebody's interested in knowing how we Indigenous people feel about projects and getting someone to ask the questions and open their hearts and can be very healing. And I think that's what Nathan was getting at, is that it's special and it makes you feel a part of a community, and that's even healing.
Yeah, you know, the word community is often used like so ubiquitously as if to imply that the people who live in a certain region or adjacency or proximity are a community, but it's an action, isn't it? It's an effort that really takes a kind of investment with care and respect. And that brings me to Richard. Welcome, Richard Perry. It's really wonderful to have you with us. I know that you know, you are of Indigenous origin, but you were raised significantly away from Alaskan culture. And in your adulthood, you chose to come back and be a part of something that's learning and transformative. And I'd love for you to talk about what brings you to this conversation, you know, from your heart.
Yeah. So as you said, you know, as an adult, I came to better understand my family and the background with being Alaska Native. I'm Yupik and Wichin Athabaskan. And, you know, these are things that I really only was able to say with any real knowledge was, you know, in my 30s. And I moved here knowing so very little because it wasn't discussed in Kentucky, where I grew up, in any sense. There really are not a lot of Native presence, you know, there. And when I moved here, that was a much different experience because you're surrounded by it in so many ways. You know, Anchorage is really kind of the biggest village there is in some ways of looking at it. And the thing is, looking for where I fit in my family and in the culture is something that's been kind of central to exploring my identity as an individual, as part of my family, and as a result, you know, to the greater extent to my past as it relates to my Native family and what that really means to me and how I plug into that. So it really was not only an emotional journey, but an intellectual one to kind of parse out, well, what does this mean? What does that mean? So I've spent a lot of time just thinking about these things, and frankly, talking with some of my friends, finding out how wrong some of my thinking was about aspects of being Alaska Native. Just as an example, kind of a simile would be, I'm a Kentuckian or I'm a Southern. That doesn't really describe all of my aspect of who I am as a person and how I'm engaged with you know, my community, my family there. And saying I'm Alaska Native is really kind of that same thing. It's such a large, encompassing, you know, kind of concept. I think it more appropriate, you know, to say that I'm Yupik, I'm Gwich'in Athabaskan if we're talking about, you know, the Native aspect. And as specific as as those, I think, is much more appropriate in certain instances than just saying all Alaska Native people or Alaska Native people. And that kind of phrase is so general, it doesn't hold a lot of real meaning. I don't remember who said it, but a philosopher that I read said something to the effect of the more general a statement, the less useful it is. So
Yeah. So
I hope that comes into the conversation.
absolutely everything that that is felt and shared here is valued and is relevant. I mean, you all are deeply invested in this work and speaking from your hearts and your heads. And I want to ask, I want to turn back to Melissa Shaginoff and ask if you would to sort of help us understand the question of cultural appropriation. How could we begin and in a sense sort of move around this circle to just begin by exploring what is culture? When we talk about cultural appropriation, it might help to back up a minute and especially because we don't want to, as Richard just suggested, speak about culture in some kind of monolithic way, like Alaska Natives generally. What is culture? Can we speak about that in some sense that is, informative and specific and respectful to help folks understand the importance of, a conversation around cultural appropriation?
Yeah, I think that I mean that's sort of the question, right? And that's probably part of the reason why cultural appropriation happens so often, particularly in storytelling in this way that that doesn't feel as as if it's harmful, right? Because we're taking parts of something that's it's pretty difficult to define, right? Because it can be so many things, and people engage, specifically with Alaska Native cultures in so many ways, because I think that everyone's sort of like their own journey of identity and how to sort of bring their culture, into their lives as far as, well, actually, no, I take that back. Everything that I produce or I create is part of my culture. The idea that that somehow parts of what I do is not cultural is just not correct, right? Indigenous people represent themselves and come from a very specific experience. So I would say that the kind of like the defining factor of like what is culture is it is people's individual experiences, but it is part of a collective one as well, and so I think that as it kind of moves between sort of that individual and collective, there's this idea that there's parts of it that people can sort of absorb and be part of or can represent, but unless you're from that specific collective experience, then it's inappropriate. I mean, I guess to answer your question, I would say that when we talk about sort of from the cultural appropriation aspect, culture is anything that's coming from that collective experience of a group, and part of I think something that you can ask yourself when you're asking, am I culturally appropriating, it's like, are you cherry picking parts of an experience because it's interesting to you, or because it's something that you feel can add to whatever it is that you're doing, without experiencing it, and I think that that's really can be kind of like the sort of the rule of thumb question. If it's not something that you have personally experienced, but from an outside perspective find interesting for whatever reason, like that's kind of like that's the rule. That's part of the rule of thumb. If you didn't experience it, representing it in any way in story and art is subverting its actual meaning, because you're not coming from that sort of deep understanding. And I've also heard too people talk about how, culture isn't owned by one person. So when you're trying to do work that, in some way has like a collaborative permission sort of aspect, you can't ask everybody who's part of that collective experience. So in some ways there's not really a good way to go about, involving, other cultures unless you're doing it specifically with people. you know um it's incredibly layered, and there's always kind of that discussion between appreciation and appropriation. And I think that that it's a very fine line to walk, and you have to look at so many different aspects of, well, if I'm appreciating this culture, am I also lifting it, and am I gaining any sort of like equitable or monetary or social capital, by utilizing these things, and I think that that these are all sort of questions that you have to ask yourself. uh, so I think when you're trying to even figure out like if what is culture, if it's something that's not a part of your own experience, uh, it's really difficult to integrate that into your own work or writing equitably.
Yeah.
That's not really answer to the question, but that's a really hard question to answer.
Well, that's kind of why we're trying to do this together, right? In a circle of experts, if you will. Nathan, what do you feel is the responsibility of artists in the discussion of cultural appropriation? What is the responsibility of artists to prevent it, and how can it happen in the right way? I'd love for you to speak about how you came into this work and how you found your way toward a collaborative process that engages so many cultural experts and artists.
Okay, I was actually thinking about this, but I think about a lot of things when I hear Melissa speak. She's just one of those people, like it gets your brain going in a lot of different ways. One of the other groups that I've been like doing presentations and talks with right now, there's a lot of people, I'm not going to mention it, but it's a lot of famous people, let's say. And this is like a very big topic in that group, the idea of cultural appropriation, and not just for indigenous peoples, which is a big part of it, but literally almost every other group you could think of, like how are trans people, how are gay people, how are any kind of people of color represented in, it goes into this big mainstream media and even down into like indie movies, independent books, just stories that 5 people are going to read in a literary journal out of Michigan or whatever. These are still really big issues. In this group of people that I'm in, one of the people that wanted to write about this group kept using this word groundbreaking or pioneering approach towards dealing with culture that everybody's using. And I remember very distinctly an older trans artist in the group like stopped this person very quickly and basically explained that the words pioneering, groundbreaking, innovative, all those things are words we kind of use as self-congratulatory words for, I mean, let's be frank here, for white male artists that start doing something that other people have been doing sometimes for thousands of years. And when a white person, especially a male, steps into that process, they are very proud of themselves and they, thump their chest a little bit, and all of a sudden they've invented this new way of being. Anyway, so this older artist just kind of stopped this journalist and said, nobody in this group is innovative. Nobody is groundbreaking. The only commonality that she saw when she looked at everybody was that people were just trying to do things appropriately and respectfully. And adding things like groundbreaking or pioneering or innovative to it really does cheapen the whole process and denigrates everything, and it creates these monocultures, and just kind of assumes the things into it. And one of the other things I thought about, and this does go back to a conversation I had with Holly a while back, we also use the term diversity a lot in those contexts where it's diverse, it's innovative, it's all these things. And a lot of times diversity, especially in where we live here in Alaska, diversity is a way of erasing or ignoring, let's say, the indigenous people in that area specifically. It's a big issue in Anchorage, and it gets into be a much more complicated issue too, because North Anchorage is exceptionally diverse if we're talking about ethnographics and the people and the languages that are there. So it's it's a really interesting conversation if we want to talk about it theoretically, but it's a really hard thing to live through. It is my personal thoughts on it. As a white man in this space, I feel the only thing that I'm allowed to do is enjoy my relationships with my collaborators, to learn to listen better, and to, how do I say it? So I'm a loud person. I get angry and things. This is something I'm trying to temper with myself. When I was younger, that little black flag anarchist kid in me would scream racism, sexism, homophobia really fast instead of trying to get people to change or to work on something. I would much rather label, name call, and fight. But working with this group is I'd say for myself, helping me become more centered and patient and thoughtful, and learning how to speak from my heart more. So I feel that's all I can offer on that. As far as like the actual workings of everything, it's all the collaborative process that evolved naturally out of wanting to hear a bunch of people's thoughts on the same stuff. I mean, that's the joy of for me, that's the joy of art, is people that are not me. I'm I'm not a Native woman. I'm not a trans African American man from Puerto Rico, or just or whatever. Like all the different voices, it is interesting to me, and when we can come up with systems that better help elevate all those voices, I feel things are richer. So inside the shared universe group, that's one of the things that we try to work on with each other, is how I guess we raise each other's voices to do that. I feel like I might not have answered that question either.
No, you're getting at something that I think is really interesting in the discussion about cultural appropriation is kind of the double-edged sword. If we view it from the opposite end of the spectrum and argue that it's really important to write from within the confines of one's physical identity or social or societal branding, then we'd only know what we know, and we would never be enlightened or curious. And so you're talking about an experience that does make you more porous, and it doesn't happen by insisting on going about it from your own instincts. You've opened yourself to others. Holly, what do you feel like is the responsibility of the artist in the discussion of cultural appropriation? What are you thinking right now?
Well, first, that's a great question, and I talk a lot about what Nathan just mentioned, which is the focus on diversity being a form of erasure of Indigenous people, because politicians always want to celebrate those things, diversity, but it's a way to to take the focus away from the indigenous people and the issues that they're dealing with. And it's frustrating for me. So when I hear diversity, I kind of cringe at it. It's great to be a diverse community, lots of voices, that's great. But, you know, the Native people of Alaska specifically have been marginalized and oppressed so much, and have lost so much. And of course, that's where my heart and my passion is to speak out about that, them being oppressed, about us being oppressed and marginalized, but also making sure that in these discussions that we're recognized, that we're not just the other, right? What was the saying with this latest election? We were just clumped in as something else, right? With them, and that's crazy to me that we're just being discounted completely from the conversation now. You know, we're just something else, and maybe our numbers aren't as high as other groups, but that people have lost sight that we're the original people of these lands. That's crazy to me. So I was thinking about that. I was also thinking about culture and what that is. It's people, and then about appropriation with relationship to culture. And I think the scariest thing for me is when other people, outside people, take the place, and this is appropriation, take the place of an indigenous or person from that culture with their own interpretation, right? I think many books have been written and touted as expert opinions, but you know, they're from explorers, and those people weren't part of the culture. So you're not getting the whole story. You're getting what they thought was exotic, what they thought was interesting. So you're not getting the whole story when you read it from an outside perspective. You're not getting a true understanding. And I think it's so important that we no longer are exotified, but that we are complex, multi-layered people with issues like every other person, and not just the stoic Indian, for instance, or the happy Eskimo. You know, I just said the E word.
Yeah, you're speaking about that tendency, especially the kind of racist American tendency to first of all classify by race and then sort of flatten people into these categories in terms of how they're understood and approached.
Exactly. And that speaks right to appropriation, right? Because and then it's easier to take from people who aren't complex like you are, right? Mm-hmm. Appropriation is taking from those people. So yeah, that's that American, and it's not just American. In Greenland, they deal with it with the Danish. Right.
So you've been doing many different art forms, but you've been doing tattoo for a while, and I'm sure you must be approached by people who are not Indigenous about tattoos. And I'm really curious if they are asking you to put, customary tattoos on their bodies, and how do you maneuver these conversations?
I think I've become really good at calling out, like, what's the importance if I tattoo you with our markings? It's important to us and healing to us, but if I mark you with it, that it dilutes our healing, but also takes away from you as a person. Each of us come from a rich background, and if you go back far enough, most of us have tattoo traditions. So I asked them to go back and look at their own cultural identity, their own background, to find out who they were. I mean, that's where the celebration in tattooing is for me, is finding out who the people are and let's celebrate that culture, you know, that heritage.
Yeah, yeah. Richard, one of the things that brings us to the conversation is the work that Shared Universe has done in writing about alternative histories of Alaska. The question of what is the value and purpose of writing alternative histories of Alaska, and what responsibility does a person who operates from a distance have to a culture? Can you tell us about your work and concerns in relationship to this question, and specifically starting with the value of writing alternative histories?
I think one of the more interesting aspects as a storyteller and as a person who enjoys hearing stories, for speculative fiction or talking about the future, is that it's a way to put on a veil and talk about things that are important to you, now. It provides a step back to take yourself out of the equation, as it were, in today's context, and put a new light, a spotlight on a specific thing that you'd like to bring up as part of the narrative, if that makes sense. So,
Absolutely.
what is it about the future that's so enticing? Well, it's not now, it's not the past. It is certainly connected in a lot of ways, but you're framing an aspect of a story that you want to tell and share. And what is it that, what's at the heart of it? And what do you want to discuss? Can be both an intellectual and emotional pursuit, in context to telling the story.
And speak a bit about what you feel are the artist's responsibilities in asking questions and telling stories that might be outside of their experience, where they're imagining themselves or others.
So I think, and this is very central to our group in a lot of ways, this discussion about getting it right, and what is it, right? So when I speak about the story I'm sharing with the others, there's certain aspects that I don't know a lot about because I haven't experienced it. As an instance, I asked Melissa, well, what would be the appropriate regalia, attire that a person would have in this region? And we spoke about that at some length. And living in Anchorage provides me a context in a lot of ways, but it doesn't in the interior. It doesn't, over in the Kuskokwim River area where some of the stories happen. So in context to the group and how and what the artist's responsibility is, I think it's being fair. It's telling a story that reflects reality, and being truthful. That's something I think is important to me. And there's certainly ways to parse out what truthful is. There's points of view. There's big truth, little truths, and when we're telling a story, having an audience and there's a weight to that responsibility to make sure that if you're going to tell a story, that narrative about something that's specific, you want to get it right. I'm sorry, I'm feeling a little flustered on that.
Yeah, it's a sensitive topic, and I really respect that all of you who are leading this conversation through the work that you're doing, and the vulnerability that you place yourselves in, because you're in a position of not just being a maker and responding to your own experience, but also representing your cultures. And Melissa, I'd like, if you would, to ask you to respond to that kind of multiple roles that you all are playing artists and individuals at times being asked to be spokespeople. It's a lot. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I also just want to acknowledge too that, with our group that's here, Holly, Richard, and Nathan, today there's something about this conversation. It feels heavy. It feels like we're all kind of going through a lot right now. And so I just want to recognize that, and just say thank you, for everyone to share kind of where you're at, because I think that in so many ways, when we talk about cultural appropriation, we over intellectualize it, right? Because we're trying to like sort of like make this sort of like understanding and make things sort of black and white as far as like what's right, what's wrong, and then also having to address it in so many ways, right? And I think that part of what Holly was sharing that really was kind of getting to me is that there's this kind of like this it's continuous and constant, right? This sort of being in this teaching space and talking about this, and it's important. And I think that like people like us do it, people like Shared Universe always are addressing it because it is so important, because it is a personal and emotional thing for people, to see yourself represented and misrepresented, to see things that you hope for yourself and for your community, opportunities, stories that you want to be told, to see them told without your permission or without your collaboration. That kind of thing is a really kind of a difficult pill to swallow, and it's as simple as I think Teddy Mayek said it, and there's an article that I was trying to like upload it to Google Drive, because I know you can share Google Drives, but maybe I'll upload it to my website or something so people can access it. But it was a very short article he wrote about and the title was How It Feels to Have My Culture Stolen, and this is an elder, just talking about kind of the experience of seeing his songs that he had written, be sort of like put into this sort of opera space, on the East Coast, and somebody sort of appropriating him from that direction, and it's a big important, like a very important tenet of Alaska Native cultures and of Alaska. And I don't want to, of course, like say the monolith, because it's not all cultures, but I will say that for my culture and for the people that I know, recognition is so important. It's part of Indigenous ways of being, to publicly recognize people in the work that they've done. You do that because you want to be, just in very basic terms, you want to be in allegiance with each other so you can continue to survive, continue to thrive. You want to have good relationships with people, and so I think cultural appropriation is kind of doing that to sort of lift yourself up singularly this way, and I've talked about this a lot, where it's, it's not taking whatever powers and privileges you have and spreading them sideways amongst people who are shoulder to shoulder with you. It's in a way that's sort of to lift you up, and you have to recognize, whether it's monetary capital or social capital that you're raising for yourself, by misappropriating, cultures or misrepresenting and appropriating cultures. I think that what Holly was saying was just really resonating with me, because it is kind of an emotional thing, and it's not an over intellectualized thing, and it's not something for anyone who's not part of those cultures that are being used to disagree with. And maybe that's a little bit of fighting words, but I get asked that constantly, of being like, well, I'm appreciating, I'm using my platform to sort of lift up your culture and bring it to the world. And Okay, that's what you think you're doing, but what you're doing from the perspective of the culture of which you're trying to represent is that you're confusing the narrative. So when we are doing the same thing, when we are out in the world telling our stories, nobody believes us because it's not what they've already been listening to. You know, it's this perpetuation of stereotype. It's a perpetuation of sort of this monolithic culture of Alaska Native people, and it's Western romanticism, and we don't need it anymore. And I think that, you know, the what everyone has sort of touched upon and getting to, you know, is that it is a lot of labor to go through this and to discuss it. And there is so many resources and so many guides out there that if you're moving through and creating work that you're worried that is, you know, bordering on appropriation, that you can find, you know. And you know, I'll certainly make myself available to anybody, you know, at least on this call, who wants to talk about that. And I volunteer that labor because I acknowledge the power and privilege I have, you know, to represent, you know, Otna people at the moment. But I am not the only Otna person. So that doesn't mean that whatever I say or whatever you collaborate with me represents Otna culture, you know. And so you have to understand that it's much more nuanced in that. You know, I also think too that that, you know, like Nathan said, that, you know, appropriation isn't just happening, you know, with indigenous cultures. It happens across the world, you know, so much, you know, particularly with you know, Western imperialism that's happened in here in capitalism. But I will say that we are all living in Alaska, or at least some of us that are on the call, or, you know, specifically the Shared Universe Book Club is speaking from Alaskan stories. So you have to ask yourself and challenge yourself to say, am I trying to absorb and pick the lowest hanging fruit? You know, because so many people who are not from this place or are not indigenous, you know, can see the parts of our culture that is visible. But you have to remember too that we are living within a system that only allows certain parts of our culture to be visible. They allow our art to be visible. They allow our music to be visible. You know, those are the things that are visible and been sort of accepted into sort of Western systems. You know, and you have to understand that if that's the only thing that you are seeing, if that's only visibility that's available to you, you're not allowed to consume it. Not everything is for white consumption, you know. And I have to include myself in that too. You know, I am multiracial, but I'm also, you know, somebody who's been urbanized and is consistently learning. So you always have to be checking yourself. It doesn't matter really who you are, you know. And so you have to understand that you know, that culture is, I mean, maybe some of you who are in education have seen this infographic, which is culture is an iceberg, meaning that you have like the lowest hanging fruit on the top, the beautiful things that everybody wants to consume and sort of cherry pick and represent and show on the top. But below that is deep understanding, connection, relationship, you know. And if you want to be, you know, someone in good relationship with people, in good collaborations, that means that you have to take that deep dive and do the work. Because if you did the work to be in deep relationship with Holly, with Richard, with myself, then we would be having like a very sort of equitable exchange like we have with Nathan. You know, it's about telling our stories in a circle, not just one person raising himself. Sorry, I just needed to get it out.
It was beautiful.
I'm so glad that you did. Thank you. Thank you. Nathan, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm again, this is Melissa. Every time she talks, like I got a million things I want to say. And she's exactly right. It does feel exceptionally heavy today. It's a heavy topic and it's a hard topic. It's an emotional topic. And everybody's doing really good keeping their emotions in check today, which I also want to acknowledge. But I think Melissa was starting to get at one of the things that's not heavy about this. In fact, it's the opposite of heavy. It's the most light, beautiful, wonderful thing that happens when you actually do this hard work with other people. So to set it up, a lot of Alaska gets put into media, and you see it, and you start watching it, and it's northern exposure, and you're like, I don't know a single one of these people. I don't understand why they're acting like this. It's a missed opportunity to actually have good representation that feels good. And we got this when we did the Comic-Con in Fairbanks. Demi was with us and we were working that booth, and Alaskan folks were coming through and reading the comic books. And then the conversations we started having, where everybody's just kind of got a built-in apprehension, like they kind of know the representation is going to be wrong, most of it like severely wrong, and so they're hoping that it doesn't read racist and is just like passable. But and if I start cussing, I apologize. There was tears in Fairbanks some of those times, because the representation was for kids, and kids had, for lack of a better term, positive, respectful representation of languages and cultures, and that became the conversation. Is like, how come this can't happen more often? And a lot of this came out when we were also talking with Rochelle and Dewey. Molly of Denali is a very similar thing, where they work exceptionally hard to make sure, and I'm talking like the colors of the sky are reflected. I mean, these are people that can tell you the difference between different like native accents from villages. Like they put very, very hard specific work down. And the end result is you actually have a superior art piece. It's just way better than anything else if you didn't do the work. And so I'm a little confused why somebody would actually want to get through it so fast without that deep dive, like Melissa's saying, because at the end, it's just not going to be that good. Holly's tattoo work is some of the best artwork going on in the fucking planet right now. And I'm not saying, I'm just saying, because a lot of it's not open for everybody to know about. It's a space that knows what it is. And I mean, I'll say I appreciate it, but I actually just really love that project. I think it's wonderful. I think Molly of Denali is wonderful. I'm not going to write an episode of Molly of Denali. I'm not going to go get tattoos, but that space is vital, quintessential, and magical, and it should be talked about in those terms. So the non-heavy part of this, I think I got kind of sidetracked. The shared universe group really just try to keep kids in Alaska is the first audience. Like who's looking at this, and why are they looking at it? And when you keep that and don't overcomplicate that, it just makes everything better, and you're willing to do the hard work, because all of us want to work hard for kids. None of us want to do a half-assed job for kids. So that's that was what I thought of when Melissa was talking.
I also want to say too that there's a way forward as well, because I do think that, many artists in Alaska who are still like still creating, have like fallen, into maybe appropriation sort of waters, right? But I just want to, recognize too that like if to not over intellectualize kind of like this right or wrong, nobody's, to use the millennial term, canceling anybody. Right, this is all about kind of like this sort of growth, and how do we learn to be in better relationship with each other, because when we learn that, then we're actually embodying something that's so connected to the land in Alaska. Being in relationship with each other is just as important as being in relationship with the land, the waters, the animals, and stewarding a place. That's truly like an indigenous value. And that's something that, of course, we always need to give credit and power back to indigenous people for sharing with us. But it's something that we all can can appreciate and embody in the work that we do. If our first goal is to be in good relationship with each other, then we're going to be, be doing those deeper dives, and cultural appropriation is going to become less and less of an experience that we see, and I say it's an experience because when Holly, Richard, I see cultural appropriation happening, it's a hurtful experience. So I think when people try to sort of downgrade having an emotional reaction to those things, or it feels, it just feels like another hurt, So it's like, how can we move through that and learn, and again, there's lots of resources, and I'm happy to help direct and share with people those things. But, this is just to say that, that there's like a way forward, and that, like, I don't know, maybe I'm optimist, but change is completely possible in these things. We make mistakes, and but that's like the act of decolonization, is like undoing these things and creating spaces where we can live today in equity.
Yeah. I want to acknowledge that we have, many really thoughtful listeners, artists and thinkers that have joined this conversation, perhaps mostly just to listen. But Petra Leszewski raised a wonderful question. It resonates a lot for me in terms of how important is it to learn language. What opportunity might we have if children across Alaska were learning local Indigenous languages in school, to start to build more understanding in some of the things that you spoke of as not being available for consumption at the surface? What could language learning offer?
I think I'll just chime in.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, as an Inuit person, Indigenous person of Alaska, obviously, even me learning language is hard to come by, and you have to work at it because it's not offered. It's not part of a curriculum. It's not even part of the system, right? In standard school practice. So obviously that would be a dream, is that our children are learning their language, but that puts a lot of emphasis on one aspect, as Melissa was saying. There's a whole bunch more to learn about culture and where each child comes from. And that also puts a lot of pressure on the parents. As a Native parent, how much you can give your child. And most of us are raised by people who are raised by boarding schools. So do we even have that background? Where do we find that background? How can we access it? So that's a huge question. And of course, that would be lovely, but it isn't realistic in the biggest Native village in Alaska, which is Anchorage,
Mm-hmm.
And the school district, there's one school, yeah, but what about all the other kids? What about junior high and high school? And there's nothing right now that is full on. So that isn't even an option to us. And obviously it'd be nice, but it isn't happening.
I think, yeah, it's a long road, right, Holly, to see that. I think that the integration of language, into sort of like into our communities is so important, or really a reintegrating, and I think that there's like so much knowledge to learn and stuff. I would say that from like the perspective of like my tribe and so whenever I do any sort of teachings, like I always kind of like run through whatever I'll be doing with them, with my council, and to make sure that I'm not, overstepping or sharing something I shouldn't share. And that's something that's always like they want to see. They're like, oh, I wish, because in Chickaloon, it's right above like Sutton and Palmer, right? That's where I'm from. They always say that, oh, it's like I wish we'd see language more. We wish we would see language on our signs and all these things. We wish people would try to do the work to learn language, right? And I think that's kind of like part of that process of change. I would say that like seeing people learn language, that would be amazing, because not only are you learning another language or learning about that culture, you're also like learning about the most like effective technology on, in Alaska. Our languages are so perfectly attuned to the land in every place that you're within. People from the Arctic regions could communicate, the slushy ice that you can walk on, when you're walrus hunting, that whole phrase in a single word, and that's like how their language is designed to be so efficient and so in tune with the land. It's like language, is so perfectly designed for each place that it lives in the region. And what an amazing tool for our entire community if everyone learned language, if everyone learned the indigenous language.
Nathan, you had a comment that in response to these points that Melissa's making. What is it that you might share?
That was in response to Leo talking about music. I've heard cultural appropriation discussion, if we want to keep it on like the region we're in. Inuit throat singing is a very traditional, deep cultural thing that happens in Inuit communities. And I've definitely seen some European people do that. And the same sort of thing happens, like if a Native person expresses concern that this is going on, that it's cultural appropriation, they get minimized and just ignored. Usually is the easiest way, especially in a European context, like just ignoring it and it'll go away. But it doesn't change the fact. And I mean, I would say that if we're talking cultural appropriation, rock and roll music, stealing from Black musicians, it is a pretty deep history. But I think it's just it's a part of Western society, especially that colonial impulse that's still very present in everything. I do see cracks in that where things are starting to change and move. I would like to see in Alaska where every child is expected to learn the indigenous language of the area they're in, and to have like a working knowledge on that culture. But I think it was Melissa just said it's a long road right now. But I think everybody in the fight right now is we would prefer a shorter road, but we're going to keep fighting, even if it's a long road, even if it's 5 generations from now. That's part of being a good ancestor and a good steward, a good teacher. So
Thank you. Thank you for raising that point and for the work that you're doing. You started out, speaking in this conversation today about the kind of opportunities that this work offers in terms of a gift. And I just want to say that, among the gifts that you're giving, all of you, is, your accessibility to a conversation like this, in which all of us have so much to learn. There are questions that have been coming up in the chat, and I just wanted to invite folks who've joined us, like Leo, if you'd like to unmute and just share your question, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, when I asked why music doesn't seem to have this problem, I didn't mean that music didn't borrow or steal across culture. It's just, it's happened so many times, and maybe there's a problem with the Inuit. Was unaware of that, but they don't seem to have a problem with appropriation. I just got done watching Ken Burns's jazz series and looking at all of the music that was borrowed, integrated, whatever, into jazz. There never seemed to be any issue about whether the music was stolen from Zydeco or any of that kind of thing. So that's what I meant when I said it doesn't seem to have this problem that somehow in music, when music crosses cultural boundaries, it's always viewed as a good thing, as a mixing, as a constructive thing.
I don't think historically that can be defended as truth, though, that monolithically that borrowing is always healthy or fair, that, you know, there was a tremendous amount of taking that happened. And we could take the Rolling Stones, for example, and all the music that they took from, you know, a Black experience. Jazz is interesting because it's a new form. I'm curious to know, you know, it's a form that happened in an intersectional space. I'm curious to hear what responses some of our featured guests have on this thought. Does anybody want to take that one up?
It's a very difficult question to answer, right? You know, because also we're not talking specifically about the genre, you know, but I will say that, you know, and not to like, you know, Ken Burns is telling a story from a very specific perspective as well, you know, and like, so yeah, I think that there's room to be critical of these things and these representations, you know, and just, I think that it's just always okay for us to be looking at kind of what we're doing in our culture, you know, our modern culture, our collective sort of experience of being artists and creative people. It is really difficult for people to accept correction and listen to criticism, you know. And I think that because it's always sort of this idea that like, oh, this person's slapping their hand because they did something wrong, you know. In some cases it is, but I will say that you know, in order for us to like keep moving forward, is that we have to be open to that, you know, and open that like if we are working within these sort of like nuanced spaces of music making, of storytelling, you know, and we're either peripherally being influenced or even directly collaborating with a person or a group of people from a specific culture about that culture, you know, that there is definitely room for mistakes, and that so if we acknowledge that we can make a mistake, then we have to acknowledge that we need to be able to listen to that criticism and how it is that we take the next right step and change in the future. You know, I mean, that's just like where we have to land, because I think that otherwise, then, you know, I art might be really boring. You know, if we're not kind of like living in that space that we can grow and take those risks to do those things. But I mean, this is a topic, you know, and this is like you know, we have so many people listening on the call and stuff that, you know, have been on other calls and such, but you know, we bring this up because it's important, you know, and that because it needs to be given specific attention, you know, and things that, you know, that need to be given specific attention, then we also need to be willing to grow within them and grow within, you know, this question, you know, and now I'm kind of like trailing off, but but I will say that if we kind of like live in that idea that you know, if we're going to be collaborating, if we're going to be, you know, working with people from specific cultures to represent their experiences, we have to also recognize that that this is a complex and nuanced story being told, right? Just that interaction, just that collaboration. Our collaboration with Shared Universe is an incredibly complex, nuanced story being told, you know, and because we're trying to tell stories that reach so many people, right? And we're just trying to do our best. And the way we're approaching it is that we're expanding where that story is coming from. It's not coming from one person, it's coming from more people. And this is just one strategy of how to do it what we consider the right way, you know. But of course, we're going to have young eyes on us looking at what we're doing and say, wait a minute, they could do that better. Wait a minute. I mean, Nathan does every day. You know, Nathan writes while he's teaching and amongst young people. And I think that it's probably one of the reasons he's such a great artist is because of that. You know, it's because of that sort of unfeathered criticism coming from young people. So I don't know.
I think to
That's
add to
great.
that a little bit, I think some of the issues actually about positions of equity or authority. And this, you know, if you're melding music together from two equal cultures, acculturation isn't an issue. Assimilation of a music and taking it and mutating it into something that it's not is a completely different thing. So I think about a position of equity, you know, when it concerns sharing, you know, and growing as an artist.
Honestly, I
And
think it would be
sharing well.
interesting to have some Alaskan musicians talk specifically to this. The Blanchett brothers, I think immediately would have a lot of things to say. But maybe that's a discussion for another time, Asia.
It sounds like a great idea. Thank you. Well, I'll make note of that. I'd love to speak with those guys on the topic. It's been really great to speak with you all on this topic. I want to thank you so much for your work and for your time and the care that you invest in helping people to understand the role of being a better audience and supporter is to bring questions and nuanced ones, you know, to the reading and the dialogue that we have as cultural consumers. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care. We'll be back in 2 weeks with Dasha Kelly. She's the Poet Laureate of Wisconsin, who's now spending quite a lot of time in Anchorage. And she's going to, you know, be exploring the impacts of that migration and her work as a Black American poet.